It was a week or two before Christmas, about 3 years ago. I lived alone in a single family home, and living in the north, winters get pretty brutal here. I was glad to be off work this day because the blizzard that came through was wild. Almost 3 feet of snow. I stayed in all day, of course. It got even worse at night, but I was cozy and I ended up just grabbing a few blankets and falling asleep on the couch downstairs while watching TV and listening to the wind outside. I slept like a rock for a couple of hours, a good 2 or 3 I'd say, before I jolted awake. I was really confused for a second because I felt like I heard light knocking, but also felt like it was part of a dream I was having. Now that I was fully awake though, I didn't hear anything. I brushed it off and sat up, figuring I should probably just head upstairs while I was up. I shut everything off and walked toward the stairs, but as I passed by the front door, I got this feeling that I should check just in case. I looked out the peephole at first, but it was blocked by snow or ice, so then I opened the door. No one was there. However, in the thick snow were clear signs someone had been there. Because the snow was so tall, there weren't distinct footprints, but you could tell someone had dragged their legs all the way up here, and right up to the door, and probably took the same way to leave. The conditions were full-on whiteout, so past 5 feet from the porch, I couldn't see a thing, not even the road at the end of the driveway. If someone was still out there and had just left moments ago, I didn't have a clue. I closed and locked the door. I felt really uncomfortable about it, but I think my first thought was that whoever it was might have been lost in the weather and going door to door to try and get help. Why else would anyone be out there in the middle of the night? And because they were gone, I figured they just moved on to the next home. I didn't know what else to really think or do about it. I went upstairs and got in bed. Took a bit to get myself to fall asleep, and this time I didn't wake up abruptly. However, the way I woke up was really strange. I was freezing, like full-on shivering, and it was so cold in the house that I could see my breath. I actually whispered what the hell under my breath because it didn't make any sense. My room was dark, but all the windows were closed, and obviously I'd had the heat on in the house all day and never touched it. Something had to be wrong. I checked the time and saw it was only 2 hours after I'd gone to bed. I got up and walked into the hallway. It was just as cold. I knew it was below zero outside, and I swear it had to be around 20 degrees inside, so it was painfully cold. I think I'd heard too many horror stories, because as I walked downstairs, I half expected to find the front door wide open, and wet shoe prints all over the house. But I didn't. It was closed, and there were no signs of anyone breaking in. I hurried to the thermostat that was right in the front hallway. I stared at it for a moment. The physical dial was set to off, which I was 100% sure I didn't do, but also the screen wouldn't even turn on. Every possibility ran through my head in that moment. I just couldn't understand that if this was an intruder, where were they? And why mess with the thermostat? I was scared, and really wasn't sure if I should check the house or call the cops. I know it sounds silly, but I knew if I called the cops and it turned out no one else was here, I'd look insane. I decided to at least go back upstairs to get my phone. I quickly started walking to the stairs, and just when I got to the bottom, I heard a sound behind me. I knew that exact sound the instant I heard it. It was the couch. It always made that same squeaking sound anytime you moved on it. I froze, then turned around. I took a couple steps, just enough so I could lean my body around the corner and look into the living room. What I saw was the most disturbing image that I still can't get out of my head. There was a man sitting right on the couch, facing forward, but his head was turned and looking at me. It was dark, but his eyes were wide and lifeless, and he was smiling. Not some over-the-top, teethy grin, but just enough to know this guy was crazy. He didn't really react to seeing me either. He stayed sitting and looking at me, not saying anything or even so much as blinking, just holding a stare. I honestly can't even remember how long I stood there in absolute terror before I ran upstairs. I got on the phone with the police immediately and locked myself in the bedroom. Only 30 seconds later, I started hearing footsteps coming up the stairs, then down the hallway. I saw his shadow move right behind the door. He knocked 3 times on the door, very slowly, like he was taunting me. Then he walked back toward the stairs, and I couldn't hear anything after that. What was so terrifying was this guy clearly wasn't normal, so I had no idea what he was going to do next. I stayed locked up in my room, waiting and freezing, for almost 20 minutes before the police made it, and the guy was already gone. There were no more tracks in the snow, so it looked like he probably left out the front door, which is also where the police think he got in from. I didn't remember whether or not I'd used the bolt lock. I know I used the main door lock on the handle, but if that was the case, police seemed to think he picked the lock to get in. To me, this feels hard to believe though. He didn't look like he was mentally well enough to be capable of picking a lock, but maybe it's easier than I think. I don't know what insane plan he had next, or why he was acting the way he was. From his smile, the whole thermostat thing, and even the knocks on my door, it's even more creepy and disturbing knowing he was basically playing with me. I hope it was just some freak, unlucky incident that never comes to anything else, but I'll probably never stop losing sleep over the unsettling look on his face when I found him sitting on the couch. This was in 2013. I lived alone with my dog Amber in a forested neighborhood with small, quiet homes. Amber was a large husky with amber eyes, hence the name. And being a husky, we went for a lot of walks in the winter. This night, after getting home from work at 9, I immediately got her leash and took her out for a walk on the trail behind the house. It was a trail that went behind the neighborhood, through the woods, and connected a bunch of parks together. It was kind of like a forest preserve trail. There was a good amount of snow on the ground, but Amber loved it, so I toughed it out. It was nice and quiet outside that night, the sort of quiet you only get in the winter because no one else was out. We got a half-mile in, so maybe 10 minutes into the walk, when Amber suddenly stopped, perked her head up for a second, then turned around. At first, I thought she was looking at me, but then I saw her eyes were actually looking past me. I turned and looked over my shoulder. There was nothing behind me. The trail was empty, and the woods were silent and pitch black in every direction. I tried to ask Amber if she was okay, and even walked past her and pulled on the leash a bit. She kept her eyes locked on the path behind us, but eventually, with enough convincing, she started walking again. I kept checking over my shoulders and never saw a thing, so I figured it was just one of those times a dog hears or sees something and fixates on it, even though it's nothing. She was a smart dog, don't get me wrong, but she always had her strange moments. We finished the trail and headed back on the neighborhood street. The rest of that walk, she wasn't as energetic, so whatever she thought she saw or heard, she really didn't like. Once inside, though, she was back to normal. I fed her and started making dinner for myself. I just threw some leftovers in the microwave. Only 10-ish minutes after getting back from the walk, though, Amber all of a sudden started howling, which she usually does when she's scared. She was in the living room, so I ran in there and found her howling at the window. I hushed her and walked up to the window. The blinds weren't down, so I could see outside, and didn't see anything. But after a bit, I noticed that most of the window was frosted over, except for the one spot I was looking through. It looked like the frost had melted off that part, as if someone was breathing close to the glass, looking inside. Once I realized that, I quickly pulled the blinds down. I calmed down Amber and stood there in the living room trying to make sense of it. I had no way to know for sure, but with her barking and not really knowing any other way the frost would have melted like that, it seemed pretty likely someone had been there. I went around the house and checked the other windows, but didn't see any other signs of anyone creeping around. I was pretty weirded out, though having Amber on watch for me helped keep me much calmer and less scared about it, for better or for worse. If I were alone, I'd probably have thought about calling the cops, but it really didn't even cross my mind. I ate my dinner and turned on a movie to wind down for the night. I can't remember if I'd finished the movie and had started something else, or if it was toward the end of it, but I know at least an hour, maybe two, had gone by. Amber was sleeping with her head resting on my lap, so when she suddenly lifted her head, I looked down and saw her eyes open and looking to my right. I only had a second to turn and see that she was looking at the front door before there were sudden loud knocks against it. Both me and Amber jumped up from the couch, but I quieted her down so I could listen. Whoever was outside must have heard me though, because as soon as Amber stopped barking, he called out, "Anyone home? Could you answer the door and help me out for a moment?" I didn't recognize his voice at all, and in the few seconds I took thinking of how to respond, he called out again. "I heard you in there. I know you're listening. I just need some help with directions. I'm not from here, and it's real cold out here." The way he just tried to explain his whole situation through the door without me having answered yet was really creepy to me, and something in his voice didn't sound genuine. So I stayed quiet, hoping he'd realize I was just going to ignore him and would just leave. There was a longer pause this time, maybe 20 seconds, before he slammed his fist against the door. "You're a real piece of shit. I'm sure this'll come back around." His voice was eerily monotone when he said that, and I wasn't sure what to make of that last line. It sounded like a slight threat. I heard his footsteps leave the porch and walk away. After I thought he was far enough, I hurried to the window and looked out, but I couldn't see him. I contemplated calling the cops for 30 minutes. It was one of those situations where I felt it was justified to call, but also there wasn't anything anyone could do now that the man was gone. So I ended up deciding on a middle ground of putting in a report through a call on the non-emergency line. That way they could have the incident on file if anything were to happen. After getting off the phone, I was wide awake and knew I wouldn't be able to sleep for a while. So I sat back down and continued to watch TV, volume lowered so I could listen if he came back. And sure enough, 40 minutes later, I noticed a light moving through the blinds, followed by the sound of a car coming down the road outside. And once the sound got louder and the light got closer, it suddenly shut off. I listened to the car continue slowly rolling up and stop right outside my house. I stayed on the couch and waited for a minute, listening and praying that this was someone else, and that at any point they were going to leave. But after a while passed, I got up and bent one of the blinds down, just slightly enough to look outside. There was an old, either black or gray car parked right on the curb, headlights off, and no movement in or around it. I must have stared at the car for an entire minute, waiting to see someone get out or something, when I heard a dull click sound on the other end of the house, and half a second later, everything shut off around me. The whole house went dark. Someone had cut the power. I didn't hesitate this time to get on the phone with the cops. Within 15 seconds, the person outside started banging on the door, hitting it non-stop angrily. Some of the hits sounded heavier, even shaking the house. I was sure this was the same guy from before. I told the operator what I could, and looked back out the window to describe the car that was parked outside. As I did, the knocking stopped and footsteps rushed toward the window. I pulled back and let the blinds close. He stood outside the window for a bit, like he was waiting for me to look out again. I continued whispering to the operator on the phone. Meanwhile, Amber had been barking and whimpering the entire time. And I realized after a minute that I hadn't heard anything else. It was just Amber barking. I waited 3 or 4 minutes until the operator told me an officer was 30 seconds away before looking out the window again. Footprints led away from the window, through the snow into where the car was parked before. It was gone now. Having an officer there was a huge relief, and he looked around and noted everything that happened, but that really was it. There was nothing else to do. For weeks, even months after that night, there was this lingering feeling that the man was still out there, having some sort of vendetta against me. I just keep thinking on everything that happened that night, all the way back to Amber seeing or hearing something on the path behind us. I genuinely feel like that man had been stalking me the entire night. Knowing how likely unstable and creepy this guy was, I don't think it's far off to assume that if I'd opened the door, or not had Amber with me on that walk, and was entirely alone, I could have gone missing and never been seen again. I worked at a local gas station, usually night shifts. I'd been there for over 6 years. Of all the craziness and strange characters and things I'd seen throughout my time working there, nothing even compares to what happened a few months ago. Just for a reference of the place I worked at, it's a gas station that I'd describe as being on the outskirts of the city. Not necessarily remote, but past the gas station, there was nothing for a good 20 miles. It was the place people stopped at to fill up right when entering or just before leaving town. This was in the beginning of winter, and this night it was snowing a decent amount. Enough to keep most folks home, but truckers and whatnot would still be coming through. Nothing about this night was out of the usual for the first couple of hours. I stayed behind the counter, saving all the other work for later, when I knew it'd be dead. Around 1 a.m., I got a call on the store phone. We almost never get calls, especially overnight. The only calls I'd sometimes get were from my manager to let me know something he forgot to tell me just a few minutes after he left. I saw this was from an unknown number. I picked it up and asked if I could help them. While I was talking, and for a few seconds afterward, I heard a man talking in the background, and the audio kept cutting out too, like when wind is hitting the microphone. "Hello, anyone there?" This time, no one spoke. I knew it wasn't dead though, because I could still hear the mic crackling. After a few more seconds, I hung up. It didn't feel like a prank call, but it also didn't feel like an accidental dial. Someone was on the other end, just listening. I didn't think too hard about it. 10 minutes later, I'd pretty much forgotten it happened. Starting to feel bored, and seeing the snow was starting to stack up, I threw my coat on and rolled the maintenance cart out to the gas pumps to do all the cleaning and everything before it got too bad out. It was cold and icy out, and the wind only seemed to be picking up. As I was moving between each of the pumps, I felt really uneasy. Something about how quiet and dark it was out there had me feeling off. Kinda like every time I was doing something, it felt like something was behind me. Usually being out there at night didn't bother me, so the fact I was feeling strange this night was really odd. I remember being aware of how uneasy I was, and thinking in the moment how in all 6 years I'd worked there, this was the one time I'd felt this way without any reason, which then made me think there had to be a reason. I looked around. The roads were empty, and even the town, as far as I could see, looked asleep and quiet. I finished doing what I was doing and hurried up and got back inside, warming up and scratching my head at what just happened out there. As soon as I was inside, though, the feeling went away. I thought maybe I was just tired, so I grabbed an iced coffee from the fridge and sipped on it to wake myself up. It was weirdly dead for the next hour. I think it was 2 a.m., so of course it was always dead around this time, but not seeing a single car or truck come through was weird. I started the rest of the work stuff that I had to get done, mostly stocking and reorganizing a bunch of shelves to prep for a delivery in the morning. While stocking, the phone started ringing again. I took a second, then started walking over to the counter, but just before I picked up, the call dropped. I stood there and looked at the phone for a minute, really confused. My mind instantly thought back to the first phone call from an hour ago. I tried to shake it off again and get back to work, walking back to the aisle, but as I passed by the front doors, I saw someone outside. He was far back, walking through the snow toward the building. I couldn't tell which direction he came from, but he was definitely heading in here. 30 seconds later, he walked in. I looked up from the shelf and greeted him, but stuttered halfway through when I saw his face. He looked at me with dead eyes and a narrow frown. He did not look friendly at all. The guy was pretty big too, 6 foot something with broad shoulders, and just overall an intimidating appearance. I moved from the aisle back to the counter. The man didn't speak, but made his way through the shop, sort of snaking through the aisles very slowly. He was looking at the stuff on the shelves, but it was almost like he wasn't really looking for anything. And as I watched him, I got this weird feeling that he wasn't alone. I kept checking out the windows, looking at the dark, snowy parking lot, and almost waiting for someone else to appear. The longer this went on, the more uneasy I felt. Best way I can explain the feeling was like my body knew this was the calm before the storm. Everything felt even quieter, too. My whole body felt like it was preparing for something to happen. And then, suddenly, something shifted. The man was looking over the shelves at me, and this time, when I made eye contact, he didn't look away. He held his gaze. After a moment, I looked away, moving my eyes toward the window, and immediately noticed someone out there. I only caught a glimpse of them, moving right past the window and around to the side of the building. I looked back at the man inside. He was still staring at me, and although he didn't say anything, his eyes were telling me to not move or do anything. I was sure if I even tried to pick up the phone, or tried to run, this guy would pull out a weapon and stop me. Not a minute later, I heard a thump on the back door, followed by a few more, and then a heavy metal cracking sound. The other guy had broken into the back of the building. Now, even in the moment, I was really confused. He wasn't being sneaky by bashing down the door. So why didn't he just walk in through the front of the building? The man in front of me was still staring at me, while the other was rummaging through something in the back room for a while. Then he appeared in the doorway. He looked furious, glaring at me, and then glaring at the other guy. Oddly, he didn't enter the main shopping area though. He stayed right in the doorway. But as soon as the other guy saw him, he essentially charged toward me. I muttered whatever helpless words I could to try to de-escalate, but the guy grabbed me and basically dragged me into the back room. Both of these dudes were way bigger than I was, and probably armed, so I had no chance at fighting. When we got to the back room, everything was ransacked, but the men didn't stop there. They dragged me out the door. By this point, both of them were holding on to me and forcing me across the back of the building until we got to the edge of the parking lot. Beyond that point was a field of scattered trees and really nothing else. I was still trying to plead with them, but it was like they couldn't even hear me. Whatever they were doing, they'd already made up their minds on. This was all planned. They forced me through the snow far away from the gas station. I mean, probably a quarter mile through the deep snow, to where I couldn't even see the building anymore. We were just in the middle of the trees. Then, suddenly, they tossed me on the ground, my face planted in the snow, and I waited in horror. I was scared to turn around, thinking I'd be looking into the barrel of a gun. But after a few seconds, I heard them take a few footsteps and started walking away. I still didn't trust it. I waited a whole minute before looking behind me. They were gone. I stayed there for a few minutes, knowing I couldn't just run up behind them, but also I was freezing. It was around 10 degrees outside, and I didn't have my coat on, or snow boots, or gloves. I think they really did leave me out there to die. Eventually, the cold was so numbingly painful that I had to run back. I followed the tracks from the men all the way back to the gas station, and with no signs of them outside, I quietly got close up to the building. I couldn't hear anything inside. I wrapped around to the front and saw through the windows that no one was in there, and finally ran in and called the police. Thinking on how planned everything felt by the two men, I was sure that even with a description of them, neither would be found. But the cops actually did find one of them, the one that came into the shop. The security cameras had a good enough view of his face to get an identity. However, the other guy never stepped foot in that area of the building. He stayed in the back, where there weren't any cameras. And this one guy that they did find didn't speak a word about his accomplice. In fact, he basically said nothing at all as to what they were doing. And even stranger is that nothing of value was really missing. The obvious stuff, like the cash in the register, was still there. With the entire back room ransacked, though, the guy was definitely looking for something. Something specific that he probably found and got away with. To put a bow on top of this whole thing, I asked my manager, who is the owner of the gas station, about why he thinks they broke in and what they were looking for. But he started acting really weird after that, straight up asking why I was even asking that. As if I didn't just go through a whole ordeal and almost lose my life because of it. And a few weeks later, I woke up to a call from him firing me. I was given severance pay and everything, so it was all technically legal, but extremely suspicious. After working there and knowing him for 6 years, suddenly cutting me off after a simple question was odd to say the least. Something else was going on there that I wasn't aware of, and I think he didn't like that I was trying to figure it out. Honestly though, I just feel lucky to be alive after that.